Jake Carter had always prided himself on being an easygoing guy, the kind who didn't sweat the small stuff like neighborhood politics or the exact shade of his mailbox. So when he bought a house in Oak Ridge Estates, a picture-perfect HOA-controlled community with manicured lawns and postcard-worthy homes, he figured he was signing up for peace and quiet. The streets were flawlessly paved, the houses uniform in their pristine charm, and sure, he'd heard about HOA rules, but he shrugged them off. How bad could they be? That illusion shattered 2 weeks after he moved in when a crisp white envelope arrived, stamped with the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association seal. Expecting a welcome note, he tore it open casually, only to freeze at the words. "You have been fined $50,000 for violating HOA driveway regulations." He read it 3 times, convinced it was a typo, $50,000. That was more than his kitchen remodel. What could possibly justify that? Stepping outside, he inspected his driveway. Smooth concrete, no cracks, no graffiti, just a normal slab. Confusion morphed into irritation. This had to be a mistake, a clerical glitch he could sort out with a quick call. Dialing the HOA office, he got Linda, whose chirpy voice greeted him. "Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, how may I assist you?" "Yeah, I got a $50,000 fine for my driveway," Jake said, keeping it light. "That's gotta be an error, right?" A pause, then typing. "Let me check, sir. Property address?" He gave it, tapping the counter as she worked, then a sharp exhale. "Oh, no, sir, that's correct." Jake frowned. "Correct? What's wrong with it?" Linda's tone turned saccharine. "Your driveway doesn't meet the Oak Ridge aesthetic guidelines. Section 12B requires approved materials, and yours is." "It's concrete," he said, patience thinning. "Ah, yes, but it's the wrong shade," she replied. He nearly dropped the phone. "The wrong shade?" "Yes, sir. Per the handbook, driveways must be ash gray, cloud gray, or heather gray. Yours is just gray." He couldn't believe it. "You're joking." "We take our regulations seriously," Linda chirped. $50,000 for that," he snapped. "It maintains property values," she said primly. Jake's jaw clenched. "So what am I supposed to do?" "Replace it with an approved shade or pay the fine," she answered. "I'm not paying 50 grand over a color," he growled. Her tone shifted, icy now. "Failure to comply means additional penalties, a lien on your home, or foreclosure proceedings." He gritted his teeth, foreclosure over concrete. "Who do I talk to?" "Corinne Whitmore, our president," Linda said. "She's at the board meeting Friday." Hanging up, Jake sat at his counter, reeling. $50,000 for a shade of gray. It was insane, but Linda's threat rang in his ears. He'd heard HOA horror stories, but this was next level. Friday, he strode into the meeting, letter in hand, facing a dozen board members behind a long table. Corinne Whitmore sat at the center, sharp haircut, sharper glare, peering at him like he was dirt on her shoe. "Mr. Carter," she drawled, "what can we do for you?" He held up the fine. "You charged me 50 grand over my driveway. That's insane." She nodded slowly. "It's not insane, it's policy." "Policy? It's robbery," he shot back. "You agreed to our rules when you bought your home," she said coolly. "They protect our prestige and property values." "This is about power, not prestige," he snapped, her eyes darkened. "File an appeal if you like, but we never reverse fines. Non-payment means legal action." Her smugness hit him like a brick. She wasn't bluffing. They were drunk on control, and she'd relish crushing him. That's when it clicked. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one they'd never forget. Jake stormed out of the HOA meeting. Corinne's smug face burned into his mind, her threat of legal action echoing like a taunt. Sitting in his living room, he stared at the fine notice still mocking him from the counter, $50,000 for a driveway shade. The absurdity fueled his anger, but beneath it, a plan took shape. This wasn't about concrete. It was about power, and Corinne's crew thought they held all of it. They were wrong. If they wanted his money, they'd have to claw it from him because he wasn't just fighting back. He was going to flip the game entirely. He'd buy their precious street out from under them. The idea hit hard and fast, a wild spark that felt just crazy enough to work. Every organization had a weakness, and the HOA wasn't invincible. It was a group of petty tyrants hiding behind rules. If he could find their soft spot, he'd hit it with everything he had. Grabbing his laptop, he dove into research. HOA authority, structure, limits. Hours blurred as he dug, uncovering a key detail. HOAs could fine and lien properties, but they didn't always own the land beneath the neighborhood's infrastructure. Roads, clubhouses, even whole sections could belong to private owners or developers. If Oak Ridge Estates followed that pattern, he might have a way in. The next morning, he called Maggie Reed, a real estate lawyer with a knack for shredding HOA contracts. Her office was no nonsense like her stacked files, a single chair, and a desk littered with legal pads. He laid out the fine, the driveway nonsense, his half-formed plan. She listened, scribbling notes, then leaned back, tapping her pen. "So they fined you 50 grand over concrete color?" she asked, eyebrow raised. "Yep," Jake said, frustration leaking through. She shook her head. "I've seen HOA garbage, but that's top-tier ridiculous. What do you want to do?" "Something that doesn't involve paying a dime," he said. "Something to make them hurt." Maggie grinned. "Oh, there's always something. How much pain you want to inflict?" "As much as the law allows," he shot back. She flipped through a binder of codes and records, humming to herself, then stopped with a satisfied grunt. "Well, look at this," she said, sliding a document over. "The HOA doesn't own the whole neighborhood. The street's clubhouse, key lots, they lease them from a third party." Jake's pulse quickened. "Who?" "Frank Holloway," she said. "Developer who built this place years ago, kept some parcels, including the main road." "If he'd sell," Jake said, leaning forward, "I could own their lifeline." Maggie nodded. "And charge them rent, set your own rules. If they don't pay, restrict access, shut down their clubhouse, even." That was it, the hammer he needed. Within an hour, he sat in a diner across from Frank Holloway, a grizzled old man with a coffee mug and a weathered stare. Jake spilled the story, the fine, the HOA's bullying. Frank sipped, silent, until Jake finished. "Those HOA clowns still causing trouble?" Frank muttered. "Tried fining me once over my mailbox being an inch too high." "So you get why I want the land," Jake said. "If I own it, I can choke them out." Frank chuckled dryly, tapping the table. "I like your guts, kid. Fair price, and it's yours." By day's end, Jake owned the road through Oak Ridge Estates, the land under the HOA office and the clubhouse parking lot. The HOA had no clue. That night, beer in hand, he stared at the fine notice one last time, laughing. Karen thought she had him cornered, but the ground she stood on was his now. He'd let them strut a little longer, then drop the bomb. Jake woke the next morning with a grin he couldn't shake, the weight of his secret victory buzzing through him. He turned the tables on the HOA without them suspecting a thing. Owning the street, the office land, the clubhouse parking lot meant he held the keys to their world. All he had to do was wait for the right moment to pull the pin. Karen and her board wouldn't stop. They were too smug, too entrenched in their power trip. They'd push again, and when they did, he'd be ready to watch them squirm. It didn't take long. That afternoon, another letter slid under his door, its HOA seal glaring up at him. He opened it with a smirk, already guessing the contents. A new warning, his fine jacked up for noncompliance, now threatening legal action within 7 days. They were doubling down, trying to scare him into submission. It was almost laughable. Instead of reacting, he strolled outside, scanning the neighborhood. The usual enforcers lurked. A board member haranguing old Mr. Thompson about his dry lawn, another snapping photos of a couple's flower pots. It was a community steeped in fear, Karen its petty dictator. Jake inhaled deeply, decision made, time to strike back. He called Maggie, asking her to draft a legal notice. If the HOA wanted hardball, he'd pitch it right back. The next day, he marched into their office, sealed envelope in hand, and dropped it on Karen's desk. She barely glanced up from her computer, clicking away like he was a nuisance. "Mr. Carter," she sighed, "unless you're here to pay, I don't see why you're wasting my time." He leaned in, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Oh, I've got something better," she frowned, snatching the envelope. "What's this?" "A little update," he said, grin breaking free. "Something you should see before you make more threats." She skimmed it, her face cold at first, then her eyes widened, posture stiffening. This isn't possible," she muttered, flipping pages as if they'd rewrite themselves. "It's done," Jake said, crossing his arms. "As of last week, I own the road through this neighborhood, the land under this office, the parking lot, your headquarters." Her hands trembled as she set the papers down, lips tightening. He could see her mind racing for a loophole, but there wasn't one. "You can't just—" "I can," he cut in. "And I did. Here's the fun part, Karen. I can charge the HOA for using my road, like a toll. If you don't pay, I'll close it off. No cars in, no cars out, no emergency vehicles. City'd love that, huh?" She shot up, face red. "This is extortion." "No," he shrugged, "it's business, like fining people for grass half an inch too high. I'm charging for my property. Fair's fair, right?" The board members behind her whispered frantically, their smugness crumbling. One, a twitchy guy with a thin mustache, stammered, "Mr. Carter, perhaps an agreement." Jake raised a hand. "I'm reasonable. You've got 1 week to prep. Then the HOA owes me monthly payments, street usage, office rent, penalties for your harassment." Karen's fists clenched. "You're bluffing. We won't stand for this." "Take me to court," he smiled. "Oh, wait, you can't. I own the land, refuse, and I'll enforce my rules, maybe fine you for existing." She looked ready to combust, the others exchanging panicked glances. The power had flipped. They'd bullied the wrong guy. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Oh, and tell your enforcers to stay off my property unless they're paying for trespassing." Their frantic chatter erupted as he walked out, the taste of victory sharp and sweet. Jake stepped out of the HOA office, the echo of their panicked voices trailing behind him like a victory anthem. He'd rattled them, Karen's red-faced fury, the board's crumbling bravado, and it felt good. The neighborhood stretched out before him, quieter than usual, but he could sense the shift already brewing. They'd spent years lording over everyone, and now the ground beneath their feet was his. He didn't say a word to anyone yet, letting the HOA stew in their mess. That night his phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. "HOA board just scheduled an emergency meeting. You rattled them, they know they're screwed." He leaned back, grinning. This was just the start. The next morning he sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood stir. The usual enforcers skulked around, eyeing his house warily, but they kept their distance. Word must have spread among them. Jake wasn't just a homeowner anymore, he was a threat. He savored the calm before the storm, knowing they'd come at him again soon. Sure enough, an email hit his inbox later that day, dripping with the HOA's formal tone, requesting a meeting to discuss terms about his ownership of the streets and facilities. A week ago, they'd been ready to lien his house. Now they wanted to negotiate. He replied simply, confirming he'd show, eager to see how far their desperation stretched. When he walked into the meeting, the air was thick with tension. Karen sat at the table's center, her superiority frayed but clinging on, flanked by board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Jake took a seat, silent, letting the unease simmer. Karen cleared her throat, hands folded tight. "Mr. Carter, we appreciate you meeting us today." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you do." She forced a thin smile. "There may have been misunderstandings, but surely we can resolve this to benefit both parties." Jake leaned back. "Oh, I'm all for that. You've spent years enforcing nonsense, fining people for nothing, threatening them, acting like you own this place. Well, now I do, so let's play by new rules." Nervous glances darted around. A balding guy with glasses coughed. "What rules?" Jake slid a paper across the table. "First, the HOA pays rent for my land, your office, clubhouse. Miss a payment, you're evicted. Second, I'm setting community regulations. No more absurd fines over mailboxes or driveway shades." Karen's face twisted. "You can't rewrite our rules." "I can," he said coolly. "The HOA controls homeowner property. I control the streets and common areas. You want to keep running? My rules apply." Silence fell, heavy and stunned. They had no leverage, no threats left. Karen's voice dropped icy. "If you do this, you'll destroy what we've built." "Good," Jake shot back. The meeting ended with no deal, but he didn't need one. He'd already won. Word spread fast. Neighbors, once cowed by the HOA, caught wind of the power flip. Some tested the waters, repainting houses in unapproved colors, planting wildflowers, installing basketball hoops, defying rules without fear. Jake upped the pressure, sending the HOA invoices for his land, tacking on late fees when they ignored him. They'd fined people into submission for years, now they'd taste it. Karen tried rallying support, emailing dire warnings about community deterioration, but it flopped. Residents were done with her, tired of her micromanaging, her empty promises. Her grip was slipping, and everyone could see it. Jake watched from his porch, coffee steaming, as the neighborhood exhaled its long-held breath, free at last from her reign. The neighborhood hummed with a new energy in the days after Jake's showdown with the HOA, a lightness creeping in where tension once ruled. Karen's empire was cracking, and the residents felt it. Her emails went unanswered, her enforcers retreated, and the petty rules that had choked Oak Ridge estates started to unravel. Jake's invoices sat unpaid, piling up with late fees he gleefully tacked on, mirroring the HOA's own tactics. He didn't need their money yet. The pressure was the point, a slow squeeze to make them feel the helplessness they'd inflicted for years. Word of his land ownership spread like wildfire, whispered between neighbors over fences and shouted across lawns. People who'd barely nodded hello before now stopped to thank him, their relief palpable. "I painted my door red," one guy grinned, "and no one's banged on it yet." Another tossed a basketball to her kid in the driveway, free of the old no sports equipment decree. The shift was real, and Jake savored every defiant act. Then the hammer dropped. An independent audit triggered by a fed-up resident uncovered the HOA's dirty laundry, years of mismanaged funds, blown-on office upgrades and board perks while sidewalks cracked and streetlights flickered. The news hit the neighborhood like a shockwave, stripping away the HOA's last shred of legitimacy. Karen's pleas for support turned desperate, but no one cared anymore. One by one, board members resigned, their offices emptied, their influence gone. Karen clung on longest, but even she couldn't fight the tide. Jake watched from his driveway as she packed her things from the now-abandoned HOA office, her sharp haircut drooping, her glare a mix of fury and defeat. She caught his eye and he waved, a small, smug flick of the hand. She climbed into her car and peeled out, leaving silence in her wake. The next day, the neighborhood felt different, alive, unburdened. Kids biked freely, neighbors chatted without looking over their shoulders, and the old HOA office became a ghost town. A few residents hauled picnic tables to the parking lot Jake owned, turning it into a makeshift gathering spot. Someone floated making it a park, and the idea stuck. Without the HOA's chokehold, people weren't just free, they were building something new. Jake leaned against his truck, sipping coffee, watching it unfold. His phone rang, Maggie, laughing before she spoke. "You're a legend, Carter. HOA's toast, Karen's gone, and the neighborhood's throwing you a parade in their heads. What's next?" He hadn't thought much beyond crushing the HOA, but her question lingered. He'd wanted peace, not chaos, and with the old guard gone, the void needed filling, not with another Karen, but something better. "Time for something new," he said. "No HOA, just a fair way to keep things running by people who live here, not control freaks." "Community association," she suggested. "Voluntary, no nonsense?" "Exactly," he said. "No fines, no driveway shade rules, just common sense." Within days, he called a meeting at the old clubhouse, now his to lend out. Word spread and nearly everyone showed up, standing room only, no stiff rows or fear this time. Jake leaned on the table, casual. "I think we're done missing the HOA," he started, earning laughs. "But we can't let this place fall apart. We live here, let's make it work together." A woman piped up. "Another HOA? Hell no," he shot back. "No fines, no secret meetings, no thrones, a voluntary group, transparent, focused on what matters. We talk, we vote, we keep it simple." Murmurs of approval rippled through. They liked its structure without shackles. Jake stepped back, letting them take the reins, and grinned as the room buzzed with ideas. The meeting at the clubhouse marked a turning point, a spark that lit up Oak Ridge Estates in ways Jake hadn't expected. The crowd didn't just nod along. They dove in, tossing out ideas with a fervor that had been stifled for years under the HOA's thumb. Someone suggested an online group to hash out neighborhood issues. Another pitched monthly gatherings to keep things loose but organized. No one wanted rules carved in stone, just a framework that worked for everyone, not against them. Jake watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, a quiet pride swelling as voices overlapped, laughter breaking through the chatter. This wasn't the HOA's cold, top-down control. It was messy, human, and real. By the time it wrapped up, the skeleton of a community association was in place. Voluntary, transparent, focused on practical stuff like fixing potholes or pooling for a playground, not policing flower pots. People left buzzing, slapping Jake on the back like he'd handed them the keys to their own lives. He hadn't planned to be the guy who started this, but he didn't mind the role fate had dumped on him. Over the next few days, the neighborhood leaned into its newfound freedom. The picnic tables in the old HOA parking lot multiplied. Kids scribbled chalk art on the asphalt Jake owned, and a couple of guys fired up a grill one evening, turning it into an impromptu block party. He wandered over, beer in hand, and got roped into a debate about whether to plant trees or put in a dog run. No one cared about his driveway shade anymore. His perfectly ordinary slab stood untouched, a silent middle finger to Karen's reign. The shift wasn't just cosmetic. It was a release, a community shaking off years of pointless fear. Then, a few days later, he spotted her, Karen creeping down the street in her car, slow as if she could slip by unnoticed. Jake sat on his porch, coffee steaming, watching her take it all in. The kids playing, the relaxed sprawl of people who didn't flinch at every shadow. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes flicking over the scene with a mix of bitterness and disbelief. She pulled up in front of his house, window rolling down, and stared at him. He didn't move, just sipped his coffee. "You think this is an improvement?" she finally said, voice tight. He set the mug down. "I don't think I know," she scoffed. "They'll regret this." Without structure, places like this collapse. Jake let out a dry laugh. The only thing that collapsed was your little empire. People don't need you telling them how to live. They're doing fine without you. Her lips pressed thin, itching to argue to claw back some shred of control, but the truth hung heavy. She'd lost. Without a word, she rolled up the window and drove off, tail lights fatting into the dusk. He knew she wouldn't be back. Oak Ridge wasn't hers anymore. That evening he sat back, the quiet settling around him. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, arguments would flare, decisions wouldn't always stick, but it was theirs, not some dictator's playground. Maggie called later, still amused. Heard Karen did a drive-by, guess she couldn't resist seeing her kingdom in ruins. Yeah, Jake chuckled, didn't like the view. You've got a knack for this, she said, turning chaos into something good. He shrugged to himself. Just wanted peace, got a bonus. The line went quiet, then she added, you did more than that. You gave them a shot at running their own show. Hanging up, he stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin. For the first time since moving in, Oak Ridge felt like home. The days after Karen's drive-by settled into a rhythm Jake hadn't known he'd been chasing when he first moved to Oak Ridge Estates. The neighborhood wasn't just free of the HOA's grip. It was alive, buzzing with a kind of casual chaos that felt right. Kids raced bikes down streets once patrolled by enforcers, their shrieks bouncing off houses now painted in colors the old rules would have banned. Neighbors waved over fences, trading small talk instead of dodging fines, and the old HOA office lot, still Jake's property, turned into a hub, picnic tables hosting card games and potlucks. He catch himself grinning at it all, the ordinary driveway that started this war now just another piece of the scenery. The community association took root fast, less a formal body and more a loose pact. The online group lit up with chatter, someone griping about a busted streetlight, another rallying for a cleanup day. No one forced it, people pitched in because they wanted to, not because some board loomed over them. Jake stayed in the mix, tossing out ideas but letting others steer. You're the guy who killed the HOA, a woman teased at one gathering, handing him a beer. Least you can do is help pick the park name. He laughed, clinking bottles. Fair enough. The shift wasn't all smooth, disputes flared over little things like noise or trash pickup, but they hashed it out in the open, no secret meetings or power plays. It was messy, but it worked. Maggie kept tabs, calling every so often to check in. Heard you're running a utopia now, she said one afternoon, her tone half mocking. Not even close, Jake replied. Just trying to keep it from turning into a free-for-all. You're doing better than most, she said. No one's measuring grass with a ruler anymore. That was the win, normalcy, not perfection. The old HOA's shadow lingered in small ways. A few residents still flinched at loud kids, conditioned by years of petty citations, and Jake's invoices to the defunct board sat unanswered, a symbolic middle finger he didn't bother chasing. The audit had gutted their accounts anyway, every misspent dime clawed back for the neighborhood. Karen's absence was the real triumph. Word trickled in through the grapevine. She'd moved out of town, renting a cramped apartment somewhere with no HOA to lord over. Jake pictured her stewing, surrounded by peeling paint and unchecked weeds, and felt a flicker of satisfaction. She built her throne on fear, now she had nothing to rule. One evening he sat on his porch, the sky bruising purple as dusk rolled in. A couple of teens shot hoops across the street, their clang echoing where silence once reigned. His phone buzzed, Maggie again. Final nail in the coffin, she said. HOA's officially dissolved. No assets, no board, no nothing. Good riddance, he said, leaning back. You're still the hero, she added. People talk about you like you took down a dragon. Just wanted my driveway left alone, he muttered, but he couldn't deny the ripple effect. Oak Ridge wasn't his to fix single-handedly. It never had been, but he'd cracked it open, let the people inside breathe again. The night deepened, and he watched a few neighbors wander over to the lot, lanterns flickering as they set up for a movie night. Someone waved him over, and he grabbed a jacket, joining the huddle. No fines, no threats, just a bunch of folks figuring it out together. He settled into a chair, the screen flickering to life, and felt the weight of the last month slip away. Peace wasn't loud, but it was here, and he'd fought like hell to find it. The weeks following the HOA's official dissolution felt like a quiet exhale for Oak Ridge Estates, a release Jake hadn't fully anticipated when he'd first stared down that $50,000 fine. The neighborhood didn't just shed its old skin. It grew into something new, rough around the edges, but undeniably alive. The community association hummed along, less a rule book and more a conversation. People fixing what needed fixing, arguing over what didn't, all without the suffocating weight of Karen's decrees. Jake's driveway, that unremarkable slab of wrong, gray, stood untouched, a relic of the war he'd won. He'd catch neighbors glancing at it with knowing smirks, a shared joke about the absurdity that sparked this reckoning. The old HOA lot, still his, became the heart of it all. Picnic tables gave way to a makeshift gazebo, strung with lights someone donated after a garage cleanout. Kids chased each other around it, parents swapped stories over coffee, and one Saturday a guy with a guitar turned it into an impromptu concert. Jake wandered down, hands in his pockets, and leaned against a post, watching. "You started this," Mr. Thompson, the old guy once fined for his lawn, said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Didn't mean to," Jake replied, half grinning. "Just wanted them off my back." "Well, you got us all off theirs," Thompson chuckled and wandered off to grab a soda. It wasn't utopia, trash piled up sometimes, and debates over street parking got loud, but it was theirs, not some petty tyrant's fiefdom. Maggie's last call came on a crisp morning, her voice crackling with amusement. "Heard Karen's selling her car to pay rent," she said. "Guess she's not cut out for life without a throne." Jake laughed, picturing her haggling over a beat-up sedan. "Karma's a hell of a thing." "You gave it a nudge," Maggie said. "Oak Ridge is yours now, whether you like it or not." "Not mine," he corrected. "Theirs." He hung up, stepping outside to a street alive with noise, kids shouting, a lawnmower growling, someone hammering a birdhouse together. The HOA's ghost was gone, its rules erased by people who'd finally remembered they didn't need a babysitter. Jake's role faded into the background. He'd toss a vote in the online group or show up to a meeting. But the neighborhood ran itself now, messy and free. One evening he sat on his porch, the air cool, the sky streaked with gold. A couple waved as they passed, their dog tugging at the leash. A mutt the old HOA would have banned. He waved back, the quiet settling in, not the forced silence of curfews, but the kind that comes when people aren't afraid anymore. His phone stayed silent. No more letters, no threats, just the hum of a place figuring itself out. The fight had started with a fine he'd refused to pay, a stand he hadn't planned to stretch this far. But it had, past Karen's downfall, past the HOA's collapse, into something he couldn't have scripted. He'd wanted peace, not a revolution, yet here he was, the guy who'd accidentally handed a neighborhood back to itself. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over his driveway, he leaned back, beer in hand. Oak Ridge wasn't perfect, never would be, but it was home not because of its lawns or its rules, but because the people in it had fought for it together. The battle was over, the fine long forgotten, and Jake let the stillness wrap around him. He'd come here for quiet, stumbled into a war, and somehow, against all odds, found exactly what he'd been looking for. The neighborhood stretched out before him, flawed and loud and his, and for the first time since that envelope arrived, he felt like he belonged.